very honored today to have as our guest a retired state official, well-known North Georgia, George Berry, as our special guest on this episode of Reflections on Georgia Politics. George Berry is a scholar on James B. Carmichael. James B. Carmichael, as we discussed earlier, was a candidate for governor in the summer of '46, and although he got the majority of votes, he lost the election to Eugene Talmadge because of the county unit system. George Berry has done a treatise, an excellent treatise, on James B. Carmichael, and we want to talk about that today with you, George. First, how did you get interested in James Carmichael?
Well, Bob, I appreciate very much being asked to participate in this series. My interest in the beginning was not just James B. Carmichael. For many, many years, in fact, since I was a little boy, I have been interested in the economic progress of our state. It occurred to me at a very young age, as a matter of fact, that here we were in one of the most beautiful spots in the world. Here we were with every gift that God could give a people, and I looked around Blairsville, Georgia, and Union County in those days and wondered to myself, why are we so poor? Why do we not have those things that enrich lives like people in other states do? By that time I had begun to read books and be aware that, that Georgians were only earning about half the national average per capita income. And it began to occur to me, and I became almost obsessed with the idea of trying to answer that riddle. Why was that happening? And in doing so, I found that there were many people throughout the history of our state who had stood up and who had called on us to take that road, to put ourselves in the economic mainstream. They fought against the forces of reaction, the forces of racial prejudice, against demagoguery, that we were susceptible to being led by people who appeal to our worst instincts, to our hatreds, to our prejudices. But there were always people who stood up and bucked that trend. There was a president of Emory University just shortly after the Civil War. His name was Atticus Haygood. He was the first man to use the word New South, which sort of identified that movement. And then, of course, the great voice of the New South movement was Henry Grady. He was the managing editor of the Atlanta Constitution, made a very famous speech in New York that sounded this theme in 1886. And then there were mayors of Atlanta who would be elected on this kind of platform. And then, of course, Ellis Arnold was elected to the governorship of Georgia in the early 40s, 1942. And he sounded this theme. He won against Eugene Talmadge. And Talmadge, to me, represented the other side of this argument, those forces that were trying to hold us back and keep us in bondage to our past. They wanted to find a way to re-elect Ellis Arnold in 1946 to a second term. A new Georgia Constitution was done in 1945 that permitted four-year terms and would have allowed Arnold to succeed himself, which he probably would have done. But the forces of Eugene Talmadge wanted him elected to one more term as governor, one last hurrah, even though he was not in good health at the time. And that set up a situation where there was no one to carry on Arnold's progressive policies in 1946. And Jimmy Carmichael was selected and opportuned by everybody to run against Talmadge and to try to carry on the New South movement in Georgia, which would have been much to our advantage had he done so.
Jimmy Carmichael, of course, was from Marietta in Cobb County and a very prominent citizen there. But I noticed in your treatise that you pointed out the fact that an early accident might have changed the life of Carmichael. Would you tell us about that?
Yes, Carmichael was born in 1910. He was born to well-to-do parents. They were merchants in Cobb County. When Carmichael was 16 years of age, he was hit by a car in front of his parents' store on Atlanta Road in Cobb County. It was a very serious accident. It broke his back. He affected his legs. He never walked normally again after that. But it had another effect on him. It turned this rather carefree young boy into a absolutely serious, determined achiever, which he became for the rest of his life. He was an amazing young man. He learned to walk again with the help of a cane after going through a wheelchair and crutches. He was elected president of his high school class. He founded the student newspaper at Marietta High School, which is still published today. He went to Emory University and got an LLB degree at their law school. Was a very active student. And he came back to Marietta and threw himself into the life of that community. He became head of the Red Cross, the Sunday school superintendent, the president of the Kiwanis Club, all these things as a very young man. And what's more amazing to me is that he was elected at the age of 26 years of age without opposition to the Georgia House of Representatives, and re-elected 2 years later in 1938 for another 2-year term, again without opposition. He was a very special person by all accounts. Everyone who knew him that I talked to had trouble describing the charisma and the intelligence and the warmth and the charm that he exhibited. There's no doubt that he was a very, very special human being.
After George's two terms in the state legislature, he decided not to run again and devote his efforts to the economic growth of Cobb County.
That's correct. He came in a time when Cobb was just beginning to emerge from the Depression, as so many Georgia communities were. But he held firmly to this belief that economic progress was the answer, that he would, if people were earning more money, were able to live a better life economically, that most of Georgia's problems would be solved, they would go away. And he was lucky to have some compatriots in Marietta and Cobb County that believed the same thing. And so they formed a team, if you will, of progressive leaders, and they got all of this federal money that was available to build public housing and to do other projects. And one of them was a program that was being administered by later General Lucius B. Clay, a Cobb County native. And he was charged with developing airfields around the country that were inland from the coast. And Carmichael and his friends went to see their friend, General Clay, and got one of these airports approved for Cobb County. It was originally called Rickenbacker Field. It was named for the then president of Eastern Airlines, who had agreed to serve it if it was built. And it was, in fact, built as a second airport for the Atlanta community. And even the Atlanta City Council adopted a resolution in support of this field because they thought that Atlanta would someday need an airfield on the northern side of Atlanta. But before this field could be finished, a bigger prize came into play. It was Defense Plant Number 6, a company from Buffalo, New York, the Bell Aircraft Corporation, had been chosen to build and operate a plant that would build a major bomber that would be used during World War II. So naturally, Carmichael and his friends went after this great prize, which would mean a lot of jobs for their county. And they were successful, of course. And the Bell Bomber Plant, up until that time in history, probably became the greatest poverty cycle breaker that this state has ever known. Even those of us up here in the North Georgia counties remember people who went to work for the Bell Bomber Plant and who left jobs as sawmill workers and farm hands and came back with automobiles and were able to build families and build homes, and it really made a major difference. At its peak, there were almost 30,000 people employed at the Bell Bomber Plant, and many of them, by the way, were women, and a big percentage were physically handicapped, which was always a great amount of pride for Jimmy Carmichael. Now, Carmichael, after working with Lawrence Bell, who was the head of Bell Aircraft, became the general counsel for the plant. He was chosen over the big law firms in Atlanta simply because Bell liked him. Then after a while, Carmichael started playing a larger role in the administration of the plant. And when the general manager of the plant was killed in an airplane crash in 1944, Larry Bell named Jimmy Carmichael the general manager of the Bell Bomber Plant. And while Carmichael was not a trained executive, he was a lawyer, he became an outstanding executive. I mean, he had a little cart that he rode around the plant, and everybody knew him. He could call, the legend was that he could call every employee by name. I somehow doubt that, but that's the kind of fellow he was. And people still tell stories today about seeing Mr. Carmichael on the floor of the plant. And so that's how he became famous, and how he came to the attention of those political leaders interested in extending Ellis Arnold's progressive reign as governor for 4 more years. And that's how he came to their notice.
As a candidate, Carmichael had a different approach to campaigning than Eugene Talmadge. Talmadge was a very famous stump speaker with his red galluses and his racial messages to the people of Georgia. In fact, I recall in one campaign appearance, Talmadge accused Carmichael of planning to mix the races. But Carmichael's response to that was he wanted a more progressive Georgia. That race, I think, was, and I hope you agree, was the beginning of a turn away from the Talmadge machine. It was, because of his death, it was the end of Eugene Talmadge's control over the state. And for a period there, it was passed along to his son, Herman, who emerged that year as the candidate who was elected but was not ever able to serve because the Supreme Court knocked down the legislature's decision. But if you would, going back to 1946, would you sort of give us a capsule of your recollection of that election and Carmichael's role in it?
Well, I will. A lot of people today don't remember the county unit system. This was a nefarious system which had as its purpose to disenfranchise the more developed counties and the counties with higher population. 121 of Georgia's counties had 2 votes, and 30 of Georgia counties had 4 votes, and 8 of Georgia counties, the largest ones, had 6 votes. So 3 small counties in Georgia, maybe with no more than 2,500 total voters, would have the same weight in determining a governor as Fulton County with its 120,000 votes. It was a carefully devised system to disenfranchise the majority of Georgians, is what it was, and to keep this Talmadge-dominated clique in power. That was its sole purpose. So you have to understand, first of all, that Carmichael, coming from one of the 8 counties, was swimming upstream, to say the least, to try to win the county unit system in that situation. It was, as you suggest, a very mean campaign, and it was characterized by Talmadge's demagoguery, particularly on the race issue. And he didn't miss an opportunity to remind Georgians that this Carmichael fellow, as he put it, from Cobb County would probably allow black people to vote, and that he was probably going to mix the races and all that sort of thing. And this occurred in all these small counties where the election would be decided. Carmichael was no shrinking violet. He gave about as good as he got. But unfortunately, in the end, Talmadge won about 250 of the county unit votes to Carmichael's 140 some votes. But what's more important is that Carmichael won the popular vote. He had over 300,000 votes, and Talmadge had less than 290,000. So he was the winner of the popular vote, but unfortunately in those days the popular vote didn't count. All that was to change, of course, in the early 60s with the Baker versus Carr decision of one man, one vote. And it was thrown out in those court cases. But in those days, this was 1946, that was still the governing rule, the governing law, and so Carmichael lost. The paper that I wrote, which you so kindly referred to, poses the question, the what if of Carmichael's candidacy. What if we had been able to get a 16-year head start on the progress that began, let's say, with Governor Carl Sanders' term in office beginning in 1962. Carl Sanders was in the Ellis Arnold, Jimmy Carmichael mold. He put economic progress in front of racial things and the old politics and the ties to the past. And he spent his term promoting higher education and economic development. And my theory is that we Georgians would be so much further ahead today had we listened to Carmichael, had we had him as governor in 1946, and not had to go through the Herman Talmadge, Marvin Griffin era of Georgia politics before we got to that point. But you asked about the 3 governor controversy, which I skipped over. That was an unfortunate development and made Georgia the laughing stock of the country, as a matter of fact. Eugene Talmadge died after being elected in 1946, but before taking office. And the 1945 Constitution was rather vague about how such a situation would be handled. And one provision that it had was that the General Assembly could determine who would be governor and would be able to choose from the 2 people then in life having the next most number of votes. And Herman Talmadge thought that he was one of those because, knowing that his father was dying, asked his friends to write in his name for that purpose. Well, it turned out that he was not among the top 2. Among the top 2, by the way, was Jimmy Carmichael. But Carmichael never raised a finger to make a claim to the office during that controversy. But Herman Talmadge did, and of course it was determined that he was not among the top 2 vote getters after his father, Eugene Talmadge. But that was soon corrected by a uncounted ballot box from Helena Telfair County, the Talmadge home county. Suddenly it showed up at the state capitol to be counted, and when it was, Talmadge voila, was one of the top 2 vote getters. A very fine reporter who's still living, George Goodwin of the Atlanta newspapers, investigated this case and won one of the few Pulitzer Prizes that was given in Georgia during that era for his coverage. He went down and found that all of these ballots were in the same handwriting, and they were in alphabetical order. But notwithstanding that, the General Assembly voted to elect Herman Talmadge governor. Governor Arnold refused to relinquish the office. It was a big controversy. Today it would be a media circus. It was even then, with less media. And as I said, Georgia was the laughingstock of the nation. The Supreme Court finally determined that the lieutenant governor elected in 1946, M.E. Thompson, would be the governor for just 2 years until 1948, at which time there would be a new election for governor. And so M.E. Thompson did serve for 2 years, and then ran against, no surprise, Herman Talmadge, and Herman Talmadge soundly defeated him in 1948.
George, did Jimmy Carmichael ever publicly say why he did not pursue his opportunity to become governor after that deadlock?
Papers, which by the way are very well preserved and organized at Emory University's Special Collections Department at their library, I never saw anything that referred to this. My speculation is that Carmichael had a very finely honed sense of dignity, and I think he thought that that whole mess about the 3 governors was certainly beneath somebody who wanted to aspire to be governor of our state. And I think he was just appalled by it all and wanted no part of it.
His life after politics certainly got the attention of a lot of prominent business people. You referred to one, Robert Woodruff of the Coca-Cola Company, who obviously had great respect for James Carmichael.
Yes, after he ran, he was asked by Robert Woodruff to come and run the Coca-Cola Company. In fact, Woodruff carried on this campaign for several years, trying to interest Carmichael to do so. Carmichael wouldn't do it because, and I've read some of his letters to Woodruff on this subject, and the only time that I ever saw in any of his papers his reference to his disability. He said that every day he was in pain. He said one day is different from any other day simply as to the intensity of the pain. And he said, with a manufacturing plant or something of that order, I could do it. But he said a sales organization that would require so much traveling and require that person to be so active, he just simply refused to do it, even though Woodruff offered him any position at the company, including his own. He said he would make him chairman of the board of Coca-Cola Company if he would come, but he didn't do so. What he did do was become head of Scripto. We're not aware of it today, but in those years, Scripto was a major manufacturer of writing instruments, mechanical pencils, pens, this sort of thing. They were based very close to downtown Atlanta. And he made Scripto into one of the major manufacturing concerns in this country. But more than that, he again threw himself into the civic life of Atlanta and Cobb County. He was a founder and chairman of what is now the Woodruff Art Center, the predecessor agency of the Woodruff Art Center. He was on the board of directors of many major Atlanta corporations and banks. He was simply one of those people that people turned to. governors in later years, like Governor Sanders did. He was on the Board of Regents. He was chair of the board of the Department of Industry, Trade, and Tourism. He handled all these responsibilities. I counted up something like 30 different positions that he held at one time or another during his civic career, his duty in a civic way. So he continued to be a remarkable man until his early death. He died in 1972. His later months were in a hospital where he was being affected by still the aftermath of his injury that had occurred many years before. But he led one of the most productive lives of any Georgian, and we can only wonder where our state would be today had he become governor in 1946. I think it was one of the great missed opportunities in the history of our state.
He led a very wonderful life, George, but so have you. Tell us just a little bit about your career, which has been fantastic. You've made many, many contributions to the state of Georgia, and unfortunately, I don't think everybody knows about it, but I think they should. So would you just tell us a little bit about George Berry?
Well, I am a proud native of these North Georgia mountains. Grew up in Blairsville, and one of the greatest fortunate things that ever happened to me was to come along in the Blairsville of that era, which was a much smaller and less complicated place than it is today. Much more isolated, by the way, than it is today. Graduated from Young Harris College, another great thing in my experience. But the driving force behind what I have done, Bob, which you kindly refer to, is that I have always been fascinated and intrigued by this idea of where we could be economically if we put our mind to it. In the Blairsville and Young Harris and Hiawassee of my time, we took poverty almost for granted. But as a young boy, for whatever reason, I began to read, and I began to learn that there were other way to go. There were other ways to live. There were other things to be interested in, and that there were ways to improve the way that we lived. And this has marked whatever I have done. I went to work for the city of Atlanta because of this man, Ivan Allen Jr. He was elected mayor. He was an exciting figure, and he espoused those causes that I was interested in. He ran on a platform of 6 points for the 60s, which, if realized, I knew would build a great city. And this was one of Henry Grady's points, that we could build a brave and beautiful city that would help lead us into economic leadership. And I had a remarkable time during my time at the city. I served 4 mayors, all of them great men and in their own way. And finally, my last responsibility at the city was to be head of the Atlanta airport. And if there is a greater economic generator and cycle breaker than the Bell Bomber plant, it is the Atlanta airport. Over 50,000 people work there today. When I was working there, 35,000 people worked there. And the indirect benefits were incalculable. The office buildings you see dotting the Atlanta skyline are all there primarily because of air transportation. So I always told the people who worked at the airport and when we would have meetings that we had a mission, we had a calling. We were not there to have a job. We were lifting people up is what we were doing by building a great airport. And it was the same step or the same motivation that led me to the Department of Industry and Trade for the state of Georgia. It was an opportunity that I grabbed when offered because it was the same principle involved. I was promoting investment in Georgia. I was promoting the tourism industry. I was promoting trade for Georgia companies. And it appeared to me that we were finally realizing this long sought goal of moving Georgians to equal stature to the rest of the nation, that we could have as much. These are notes that Henry Grady sounded, that Atticus Haygood sounded, that Jimmy Carmichael sounded. And then my last several years were spent with one of Atlanta's major real estate developers, and that were responsible for a lot of those buildings on that Atlanta skyline. So in a broad sense, I've been able to do exactly what I have wanted to do in my career, and I don't approach the contributions of a Carmichael or people like him, but in a small way, I'd like to think that I and thousands of others who were inspired by people like him have lifted Georgia people up to another level.
Well, you've certainly been a great asset to the state. A couple final questions, George. How should Jimmy Carmichael be remembered?
Well, first of all, he should be remembered. That's the key. So many people today don't remember these people who stood up when it counted. I think he should be remembered as a disciple of the New South movement, who had the courage and who had the guts to stand up against the Talmadge machine when it was important for somebody to do that. It would have been much easier for him to have been an executive with Scripto or to stay at the Bell Bomber plant and not having taken this step. But he didn't. He got out there in the summer heat throughout Georgia, taking the insults of Eugene Talmadge, and sounded the note. And who knows how many people heard him. There were a few that did. And for that reason, he should be remembered.
And finally, how should we remember George Berry?
Oh, well, I don't think that's a question that will bother that many people, Bob, although you're very kind to mention it. I've just been a soldier in the ranks, and it's been a great pleasure to do that. But there's certainly no reason and no desire for have my name on anything. Thank you, sir.
Well, George, I respectfully disagree. I have followed you as a professional and as a friend for many years, and I have observed all the contributions you made, not only to the city of Atlanta, but to the state of Georgia. And I know that I can speak for all Georgians when I say thank you very much. I want to reserve another opportunity to talk to you some more about your role in the development economically and otherwise of the city of Atlanta. Will you come back and join us one day?
Sure.
Good. Thank you very much, George Berry.